Good morning. My name is Kevin Ryan. I'm here with Tom Ryan, who is telling me his memories from his long and illustrious life. And today is June, June 18th. And we're talking today about the Church of the Brethren. Dad?
Yes, we joined the Church of the Brethren. The way it started was that the Krickows, John Krickow was a fellow teacher at Larkin High School with me. I taught social studies and he taught chemistry. And we had both grown up in parochial schools. He was a German Lutheran, Missouri Synod Lutheran, and they had parochial schools, and so did the Catholics. And so he was raised as a very devout Lutheran, and I was raised as a very devout Catholic. It never occurred to us that we would leave our churches, but we did. We got together on Sunday and we'd talk. Our churches were not involved in the civil rights movement or in the war in Vietnam concerns, and issues of the day were just ignored in our churches, and that bothered us. We found, John said he saw something on the Church of the Brethren on their signboard out front that indicated that they were preaching about the war, and he went to a church there at the Church of the Brethren on Highland Avenue. That's what it was called, Highland Avenue Church of the Brethren. They always named their churches with very pedestrian names that were not saints, and they were very low church, I guess you'd call it. So he liked it, and he said, we should try that. And so all two families tried. We went in and with 4 kids, and he had 2 kids, and we 3, and we went to the church all together, and we really liked the sermon, and so we wanted to know more. Well, they were having marches for peace and marches against the war in Vietnam, and this was in 1970, that when we really got interested in the church, but not interested enough to join before we went to Colorado, and but we did go on some of the marches, and I remember one. Martin Luther King march that I participated in. And we marched downtown to the Unitarian Universalist Church. It was right near the watch factory, the Elgin Watch Factory. A lot of the watch factory workers were Unitarians. And so they had built a church that was in the shape of a watch because they were watchmakers. And so it was more or less circular. And we marched into that church and we formed a circle all around the outside of the church. And we held hands and we said, "We shall overcome." And I looked to the right and left and I said, "I don't see any Catholics here. I think I'm in the wrong church. I think I found the right one." So that was our first commitment, I think, in that one march to go try out the Church of the Brethren. So we went off to Colorado for the year on sabbatical and had a wonderful time. And we attended the Church of the Brethren there in Denver. And we drive into Denver every Sunday. But we did, and then we joined the church actually in Denver. But when we got back after the year in Colorado, of course, we had this wonderful church. It had its headquarters, world headquarters. It was a very small denomination, something like 500,000 people, and scattered all over the United States from California to Pennsylvania, where it got its first start. And it wasn't Amish. People had often mistake it for Amish. Some called it German Quaker. They didn't like to be called German Quakers. They were Brethren, the Church of the Brethren. And when the women's movement started, there was some talk about calling it the Church of the Brethren. But some of the jokesters would say, how would it do calling it Church of the Sisters, Sisterhood? So Church of the Sisters. So
Okay,
anyway, it's
but there was Old Order Brethren and there was Church of the Brethren. How are they different?
they were a small denomination, and yet they argued a lot about theology and other things, and they broke into 4 parts actually. But we were the biggest. I mean, and the headquarters of the Church of the Brethren was in Elgin, and there were about 30 ordained ministers who worked in the headquarters church called the general offices. Uh, they didn't want any idea that it was some kind of Rome or they had really headquarters. They just called it the general office. And they had the pension system for the ministers there. And they had missions, world missions there. And these mostly the ministers that worked there had been in foreign countries as missionaries before they came to Elgin. So we had a lot of, when we had potlucks, I call the real altar at the Church of the Brethren was down in the fellowship hall, and we'd have potlucks. And these people had been in countries all over the world as missionaries. They would bring their favorite dish, and it was a feast. We really had wonderful potluck dinners at the Church of the Brethren. So we went there, and the first time we went to the Church of the Brethren, Marie came running out after church saying that the youth group is going on a trip, and they wonder if I can go along. Can I go along? And I said, sure, So away she went, all happy, and immediately the kids there were missionary kids, PKs they call them, pastors' kids, and they're known for not being saints like their parents, but they had a lot of church experience, and then the kids were in the youth groups, and I always thought, maybe falsely, that this was a protection for them from drugs. Drugs were very prevalent in school now. And it was a concern of parents and their kids get involved in drugs. And the Brethren kids didn't seem to be interested in that sort of thing, like a lot of other kids. I'm sure some of them were, and they tried it out, but it wasn't a big deal. So that was good, we thought, very good for the kids. And so we went on the marches, and then the Brethren had a program to end segregation. We had a small black community, and they were people that the Baptists had brought up during the Civil War as escaped slaves through the Underground Railroad, and they all lived on Fremont Street. John C. Fremont was the first candidate for president in the Republican Party. So it was from the days of the Civil War. And the kids went to Sheridan School. Philip Sheridan, black kids, did. And a good friend of ours, Chuck Medeiros, also became Brethren and left the Baptist church and came over to the Church of the Brethren. He was principal of Philip Sheridan Elementary School and had lots of black kids in his school. But they were a small group in the town, but they were segregated. They lived on Fremont Street. And so the Church of the Brethren thought that kind of discrimination in housing should end. And so there was some grumbling in the town that the Brethren wanted a black person on every block. And we were the ones that were trying to, and we even purchased a house, and then we rented it to a black family in the white neighborhood. So, we could getting really into it. And I really enjoyed all of that. And it was wonderful comradeship. I was on committees, stewardship committee, the building committee. Finally, I got elected to the church board in the Church of the Brethren. The church board was the real authority in the church. The pastor was supposed to stick to the Bible and how the church was run with, up to the board. And finally, I was elected president of the board. And then our pastor, they were a pacifist church. Many of their members had been conscientious objectors in World War II, and they volunteered to do volunteer work not connected with the war. So some of them came here from different places in the Church of the Brethren and worked at the mental hospital we had in Elgin. And they spent their years there working. And of course, they didn't get any GI Bill. They were frowned at that they didn't serve their time. But our pastor was in the Marine Corps in World War II, and then became a pastor. And
that was Don Shank.
Don Shank, right. Yeah. And we had two Dons, Don Snyder and Don Shank. We called them the Dons, and we liked them both very much. And Don Shank had served, and there was no animosity against or for those who decided to be conscientious objectors did, and those who didn't. And actually, something like 80% of the brethren around the country who were called to fight in World War II, they obeyed their draft call. And only a minority of them actually stuck with their faith and were conscientious objectors. But it was a peace church, and they thought that we should work very hard to keep the peace so that we didn't have to go to war. And that's why they were against the war. They were against all wars. The one in Vietnam, which was very unpopular at the time, but President Lyndon Johnson insisted on pushing it. And there were a lot of marches, peace marches and civil rights marches and work. And I participated in all that in a big way. And then the year that I was church board chair, Don Shank, after 14 years as a pastor, decided to leave. And I was in panic. I thought, in the Catholic Church, if a priest leaves, the bishop sends a new one in, and the Catholics have no choice. But in the Church of the Brethren, the congregation picked a new pastor, and I didn't feel I was competent to do anything like that. I hadn't been Brethren more than a couple of years. So that was a big thing, and somebody else got elected for the next year, took care of that.
But being in Elgin, though, we had 40 some odd pastors in the congregation.
Yes. Yeah. And a lot of PKs, pastors' kids, were in your youth group. Almost all the kids in the youth group their parents were pastors. And I, of course, knew all of them. And the Holdereeds had been missionaries in Sudan. And Ken Holdereed became head of the church missions. And they had missions in Nigeria and other places. But they had a new mission in Khartoum in Sudan, the capital of Sudan, where the Blue Nile and the White Nile converge. And they had been there for several years, and then he came back to head the whole mission field. And he asked me if I would like to be a temporary, part-time or relief missionary to Khartoum to relieve the two people who were missionaries there so that they could come home on furlough and somebody would be there to hold down the fort. And so I asked Marilyn if she wanted to go. No, she said, that's too much. I don't want to go. She said, I have diabetes and I don't know if they'd have the right kind of medicine there. We heard stories that if you got sick in Khartoum, the place to go was the airport where you could fly to someplace else because you didn't want to go to the hospital in Khartoum. So she didn't want to go. So I said I would go alone. Kids were gone now. They were going to go. You were all ready for college. And so I went off by myself and flew to Frankfurt, Germany, and then down to Nairobi, the capital of Kenya, Kenya, and I had on my lap I had a printer for a computer because you couldn't send things through the mail; they'd be stolen. The postal workers in Africa and in the developing world were so poorly paid that they would steal out of the mail. So I had to carry it on my lap on the airplane, and we got it there. And they were translating the Bible from into Nuer, and the Nuers were the tribe in Africa that the Church of the Brethren was ministering to, and they didn't have a Bible written in their own language. Sudan and Kenya were both formerly British protectorates, and a lot of people could speak English there. In fact, it was always, they had so many languages, different tribal languages, but speaking English was kind of the common language, and you could advance and get a good job if you could speak and read and write in English. So we had a few of these that were translating the Bible, and they had to leave Sudan. The terrible government there, very dictatorial, and cruel and brutal, was Muslim. And these people didn't feel comfortable translating the Bible in the place where the Nuer lived, which was in Sudan. The Nuer were a tribe of, they raised cattle, took care of cattle in the Sud, which was an area of Sudan on the Nile River, which flooded in the rainy season and had grass. And so they raised cows. And these people would grow, some of them were 7 foot tall. The women were all over 6 foot tall. And they had big, long legs, and they could walk. They didn't have horses, and they had to walk with the cattle through and graze them in the Sud. So that was an interesting group of people that all sat around a table in Nairobi, and we had turkey dinner. And most of these Africans, Nuer, had never had turkey in their lives. And up on the wall was a picture of the Last Supper with Jesus and all the apostles. It was up on the wall above the table. And here we were, all these different tribes, different languages, translating the Bible. Well, I was only there for a little over a week, but I did get to go out into Nairobi, outside of Nairobi, and see wild animals, all kinds of them. And the guides, of course, for these Nuer translators, they had to leave their own country. And one of them said, "Would you take something with you when you go to Khartoum?" I said, "Sure." So he gave me this box, and they were ladies' dresses. And he had bought them in Nairobi. And so I carried them to a church in Khartoum when I flew to Khartoum and delivered them. And they were for his wife. And his wife would sell them for high prices because they were very stylish dresses, sell them to the Arab women who could afford them. And that would feed his family in Khartoum. The Nuer lived in Khartoum in refugee cities, and they had huts, and they would work. The women especially would work in the Arab homes, and they didn't get paid, but they get to take the food home at the end of the day that was left over, and they fed their families with it. And then their husbands would try to get jobs. It was real poverty. I saw poverty like I'd never seen it before in Khartoum, mostly among these refugees. It was so hot. It was, we were in the Sahara Desert, really, but they had water from the Nile, and they could irrigate, and they would raise fruits and vegetables and beautiful peaches, and then sell them outside the watered areas and make a living doing that in Khartoum. But it was a poor city, and the people were poor. And we said to the men, with all the brutality and the government and all the starvation you've gone through, how did you come to be Christians? And he said, it was the only thing we could do to survive the difficulties of living in Khartoum. So they were out of place in Nairobi, and I was now in their home in Khartoum. And I lived the two missionaries went off to America for their furlough, and I was left there alone in a house that the church owned, and all alone. And I had a little electric typewriter, and I wrote things about what happened while I was there. Very exciting. I was there about 6 weeks, and then they returned from America, and I went home. But what a exciting and wonderful talking to a lot of these people. They some of them had gone to college, even the New Air, and they had written their dissertation, their master's degree dissertation. And I said, "Can I read it?" And yeah, they'd let me read it. So I took it home, and I had lots of time to read their dissertation. And it was all in English, the university there. So all of these educated people could speak English, but there were a lot of people who couldn't speak English, and I had to. I had a Jeep-like car that I could drive. That belonged to the mission, and I drove it to over the bridge over the Nile into another town, and I taught a Sunday school class or a Saturday school class. We celebrated Saturday because the Muslims all celebrate Saturday as the holy day. So we would have church on Saturday, and it was a mixture of all the different missionaries from all the different Christian churches would get together and take turns preaching, and they'd have church on Saturday. But I taught Sunday school or religion class under the Bible class under a tree in a courtyard in a church after I'd driven over there in the Jeep. And the classmate, I had, of course, speak English. And so all the students knew some English and wanted to learn more. And so I ended up talking to them about why on their foreheads they had cuts. Well, in the New Era, they were initiated. Young boys would, in their cohort, their closest friends were their same age boys, and they were initiated into the tribe by having cuts in their forehead that went across their forehead. And then when the cuts healed up, they were very black. Their skin was the blackest I've ever seen. And then the cuts would be scars, and they'd show up in a kind of a pink color. So they'd have these 4 scars across their head, showing that they were initiated into the New Era. So anyway, when they were in the Sud with their cattle, they were at home, but they were not at home in Khartoum, and they were refugees from the war. There was war going on between the North and the South in Sudan, and it went on for like more than 20 years, and a lot of people got killed, and it just ended recently in a peace treaty. I hope it lasts. But here we were, brethren pacifists in a church at war, and a very brutal regime where the 92-year-old president was finally ejected from office just recently in the last year. But he had been in power for something like 30 years and headed a police force that was especially brutal. So we had to be careful. I drove the Jeep back from teaching this class, and I ran through an open field instead of staying on the yard, and it was a shortcut. and I realized I'd gone through a kind of a garbage dump, and I got a nail in the tire. And here it was on the church. I was on the Sahara Desert, and it was hot, middle of the day, and I had to change a tire and put the spare on, and then drive the car back to the house. And that was quite an adventure that worked out well. And then when I had to fix the flat tire, I rolled it down the hill from the house to about several blocks from the house to a guy who fixed tires. And I had to get the tire nailed out of the tire and fixed. And he fixed it for $1.50. And I gave him American money. They like to have American money. It was worth more than theirs. So, and then I had to roll it all the way back up the hill and put it back on the car again. But that was one adventure I had there. And I had some others where I came home late at night after having dinner with one of the missionaries. They would invite me over just, I think, to speak English with somebody. And I'd be coming home, and it was after dark, and I couldn't find the house. And they were repairing the road in front of the house, and I couldn't go on the regular road, and I had to go on back streets in the dark, and I couldn't find the house. I was really lost. And so I finally kept calling this boy's name. I can't remember his name now, in Arabic. And
he was the houseboy, right?
Houseboy, yeah. He would mow our lawn and do different things for us. And he lived in kind of a shack behind the house that I was in. And so I got to know him, and I kept calling his name. And finally, out of the darkness came these whole bunch of teenage boys, and they came up to me real close to my face, and so I could see them. And there he was. He and his gang of kids were running around in the dark. There weren't any streetlights. It was pitch dark. And sometimes I'd walk around at night just to see what was going on. And it was so pitch dark and that people were walking. And lovers would, their homes were small. And if they wanted to have any time together, they would go out at night and walk without a flashlight. Flashlights were treasured, and especially flashlight batteries. That's the only thing they would steal. If you had a flashlight in the car, they'd sometimes just take the batteries because, and so they were walking around in the dark, and the only way you could tell somebody was walking beside you was the crunch of the gravel. And it was a eerie feeling to be in the really dark without any moon or street lights or anything. Anyway, those are some of the experiences. I could go on forever talking about Sudan and what I did there.
There is one thing you mentioned before was about having red hair.
Oh, yes, my red hair really stood out. And they had never, most of them had never seen anybody with red hair because they all, of course, were very dark. Well, the Arabs were lighter skinned, but no Arab even had red hair. So they would want to touch my hair. And the little kids were told that if they touched my red hair, I guess they'd have good luck. But some of them would tell their kids that I would eat them. If that was to keep the kids from getting too close to me and bothering me, they'd just tell them, don't bother him, he'll eat you. So they would run and scream when I came by because they had saw so few white people. So it was reverse discrimination against white people instead of the other way around. And
isn't having red hair some kind of unhealthy?
Oh, yes, that was the other thing, that when people were starving, their black hair would turn a kind of a rusty color, red color. And so it would mean that they'd gone through a famine and survived. And the mark of it was this reddish hair. So it was a kind of a sign of weakness, I guess. So they thought I was sick. because I was so white and so red hair. Yeah, that was another thing that I saw. There are a few albinos in Africa among the black, and they really stand out. And they were discriminated against because they were white, and everybody else was black. And then these few survivors of the famines, which were frequent in the area. And then,
Okay.
yeah, the Sudanese were so kind. The tradition among the Arabs, too, the Muslim Arabs, is they're very hospitable and kind, and they invite you into their home, and everybody shakes hands. First thing they do when you meet them is shake hands, and then they ask, would you like some water? Because it's so dry, everybody. So you give a glass of cool water and talk a while. And that they were very wonderful that way. And being rescued that night, I was not afraid of the boys at all, but and I can't remember his name, but I was hollering it out into the darkness, and he heard me and came to my rescue. So they were very, considering the hardships they went through, they were very wonderful people. And I enjoyed the 6 weeks there. It was like being in a whole different world.
Okay. Well, good. Yeah, we've gone on a lot longer than usual, but this is a good story. Thank you very much.
Right. Yeah, that's enough about the Church of the Brethren. I think I kind of covered it, and also my experience with them. But I had other trips I took with Brethren, and I went to